For American comedians, getting a spot on the iconic TV show Saturday Night Live was how many got their big break. Will Ferrell, Eddie Murphy, and Chris Rock all started on SNL. But for English comedians, no show like that existed. The alternative was hustling in the comedy clubs and praying for a spot on BBC's Mock the Week. For 17 years, Mock the Week was a pillar of British comedy. The show helped launchpad more than 100 comedians, and at its peak, millions tuned in weekly. It was risky, controversial, and because of that, it became one of the most influential panel shows the UK ever produced. If you landed a seat on Mock the Week, your touring numbers went up, your ticket sales spiked, and your name instantly became recognisable nationwide. Frankie Boyle, Michael McIntyre, Russell Howard, Ramesh Ranganathan, James Acaster, Catherine Ryan, the list goes on, which begs the question, why was the show ever cancelled? Behind the laughs, Mock the Week was fighting BBC rule changes, complaints, censorship, comedian departures, and a TV industry that no longer wanted politically risky comedy anywhere near primetime. In 2005, creators Dan Patterson and Mark Leveson had a vision, a weekly panel show mixing a typical game show structure with satire commentary on current news and events. During the mid-2000s, the UK saw a growing appetite for panel comedy, so audiences were familiar with the format, but Mock the Week differentiated itself by being less scripted and more raw. 6 comedians split into 2 teams, making the show basically a comedy weekly newspaper. While it was framed as a game show, the quiz aspect was always second to the comedy, and at the helm was host Dara O'Brien. When the show launched, Dara was already an established touring comedian and TV presenter. He was the perfect host for balance. He kept the BBC's need for structure while still giving the comedians freedom. Without Dara, the show may not have lasted as long as it did, because he understood the cast, and that chemistry was what made it so good to watch. During its first 7 series between 2005 and 2007, the show was shaped by a handful of comedians I'll call regulars or team captains. Hugh Dennis offered a safe but clever style of comedy. His dry delivery offered contrast to more aggressive comedians and helped anchor the show when shit went sideways. Frankie Boyle was arguably the most influential comic in the show's early days. His dark, confrontational, shock joke style gave the show its bite, and 20 years on, his moments are still some of the most talked about. Rory Bremner, Andy Parsons, and Russell Howard all became regulars through the first 7 series, and alongside these regulars, the rotating guest model meant that each week there were fresh voices and different styles, mixing it up and keeping audiences engaged. During the first seasons, the show averaged around 2 million viewers, and by series 7 it was at 3. Many fans call these series the golden age of Mock the Week, and I've put that down to a few reasons. The show's weekly coverage of politics and fast-changing news meant that each week there was a new headline, making the show feel relevant. The balance between the styles of comedians meant the conversation could go anywhere. It could go harsh, light, or serious depending on the news and the panelists. The show built a loyal fan base because of the volume of episodes. With multiple series a year, the show stayed in viewers' minds. Mock the Week flirted with boundaries between what's safe and what's not, and that riskiness generated attention, which sometimes led to outrage, but always conversation. And the one comedian creating the most conversation was Frankie Boyle. Frankie joined as a regular panelist from the start and had the most dark and provocative style out of any comedian on the show. Frankie's style made the show feel unpredictable, and as websites like YouTube grew in popularity and clips of the show surfaced, more people were tuning into the show just to see what Frankie would say. I've only mentioned up to series 7 so far because that season would be a huge turning point in the show's arc, because it was the last series to feature Frankie Boyle as a permanent panelist. The official reason given from the BBC was he had other television commitments, although many fans speculated his departure from the show was due to pressure from producers over controversies and changes in expectations.
They were definitely getting to the point where they fought to get jokes on every week, and obviously had to fight to get the stuff I said on, and it was getting to the stage where they were sort of, you got the feeling losing some of those arguments, and I thought I'd rather go before I'm doing sort of twee material about, wouldn't it be funny if you tickled a badger?
So they were clamping down a little bit on the edgier material, if we use that.
Yeah, they stopped me doing the stand-up and stuff, and I thought, well, that's a good point to sort of leave it at.
In his last few years on the show, Frankie Boyle found himself at the centre of multiple controversies due to comments he made on the show. In 2007, during a segment of the show called Scenes We'd Like to See, the panellists took it in turns telling jokes with a prompt given by Dara O'Brien.
What the Queen didn't say in her Christmas message.
I've had a few medical problems this year. I'm now so old that my pussy is haunted.
When the joke was originally aired, the backlash was much lighter. Mock the Week's production team stated there had only been 6 complaints when the episode originally aired. In late 2008, when the episode aired for the second time, the uproar was much greater due to the timing. The BBC was currently being heavily criticised over the Jonathan Ross and Russell Brand Sachsgate scandal. While hosting his BBC Radio 2 show, The Russell Brand Show, in 2008, Brand, alongside guest Jonathan Ross, called the late 40 Towers star Andrew Sachs. During the prank call, the pair left the actor a thread of inappropriate messages, including how Brand had a relationship with Sachs' granddaughter, Georgina Bailey.
I can't answer at the moment, but please call again or leave a message. Speak after the tone. Thank you.
So lonely.
Hello, Andrew Sachs. This is Russell Brand. I'm a great appreciator of your work over decades. You're going to be on my show now, mate. I don't know why you're not answering the phone. It's a bit difficult. I'm here with Jonathan Ross.
Hello, Andrew.
That's Jonathan Ross speaking now. We understand. Anyway, well, I can still do the interview to his answer phone.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
I think, Andrew Sachs, I've got respect for you and your lineage and progeny. Never let that be questioned.
Don't hint.
I wasn't hinting. Why did that come across as a hint?
Because you know what you're talking about.
Now, when you were doing...
He fucked your granddaughter!
That's his answer phone!
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I apologise. Andrew, I apologise.
It's still on the answer. It's on the answer phone!
Well, I can't help it. You were talking about it and it was in my head. I apologise.
Jonathan!
The pre-recorded show was broadcast and saw an influx of complaints, with the BBC receiving over 44,000 complaints. Following the prank call to Sachs, Russell Brand quit BBC Radio 2 whilst Ross was suspended from broadcasting for 3 months. Brand and Ross apologised to listeners and Sachs, whilst the BBC was fined £150,000 by Ofcom. When the BBC aired Frankie's joke for the second time, the issue wasn't that he'd suddenly said something new. It was that the BBC chose to rebroadcast that episode with that joke at the peak of the Sachsgate scandal, when the BBC was already under heavy scrutiny for poor editorial judgment and airing offensive jokes about public figures. It was like the BBC had learned nothing from the Sachsgate scandal. In the middle of a nationwide conversation about whether the BBC was being reckless with broadcast standards, airing a show that included a deliberately vulgar joke about the Queen seemed like terrible timing, even if the material wasn't new. And complaining to Frankie didn't matter. He made the joke and frankly doesn't care. He's a comedian and it's his job to tell jokes, and the BBC's editor's job is to decide which jokes go into the show and which don't. It began to create a rift between Frankie and the producers, as they became more afraid of what was and wasn't okay. BBC director Mark Thompson even made a TV appearance at the time defending the show due to the backlash.
Let's talk about creative risks then. This is a quote from Mock the Week last night, BBC 2, just before we came on air. Things the Queen would never say in a Christmas special, and one comedian said, "I'm now so old, my pussy is haunted."
As I said, we have many programmes in the BBC on television
But I mean,
and on radio.
acceptable?
Well, what I would say is, to be honest, I would only want to judge any remark on any programme in the context of the programme, watching the programme. I think I always find it better to watch programmes myself. I manage to miss...
I'm now so old, my pussy is haunted.
Well,
this was about the monarch.
Emily, taking a single line out of any programme, I mean...
The BBC were aware of Frankie's style of comedy and clearly fans of it, but when it began to rustle feathers in the mainstream news, keeping the people at the top happy became their priority rather than giving Frankie creative freedom with his jokes. And in the same year, almost identically, the same thing happened again. After the 2008 Olympics, Boyle made a joke about Olympic swimmer Rebecca Adlington's appearance.
What I really said about Rebecca Adlington is that she looks pretty weird. She looks like someone who's looking at themselves in the back of a spoon. When she arrived back on the flight, she met her boyfriend. Did you see her boyfriend? He was really attractive. He was like a male model. So from that, I have deduced that Rebecca Adlington is very dirty. I mean, if you just take into account how long she can hold her breath.
Following the joke, 75 complaints were made to Ofcom. Once again, Frankie, who was known for his dark and risky jokes, was not in the hot seat, as Mock the Week was a pre-recorded show with a small audience in attendance. It was the perfect place for comedians to test their material and see what worked. If a joke was shit, the comedian knew not to use it again and the editors would simply cut it out. But if a joke was borderline offensive, it was up to the editors to decide whether that joke should be included in the final show. The BBC Trust ruled that the joke was offensive and humiliating with no editorial justification for it being broadcast. Adlington formally complained to the BBC that the Trust ruling was no more than a slap on the wrist, whereas Frankie dismissed the Trust ruling as worthless. The BBC commissioning editor said she would like it cut out. For reasons which are not entirely clear, it was not cut out. It was an editorial mistake to include it. After leaving the show, Frankie went on to have a successful career. I was close to doing a video just on him, but I decided to do the whole show instead. But if there's anyone you want to see videos of in the future, let me know in the comments. There was now not only a spare seat on the panel, but huge boots to fill that fans were skeptical could happen. The producers were forced to rethink the balance of tone, style, and panel dynamics. And so the show changed from being dangerously edgy to more mainstream panel comedy. Instead of declining, the show actually grew. The 2010 UK general election gave the show a huge injection of material, with episodes around this time peaking viewership. And despite Frankie's departure, the show still pushed boundaries. Hugh Dennis and Dara kept political jokes tight, and the wave of younger comics brought a whole new energy. Between 2010 and 2012, Mock the Week became a launchpad. Russell Howard had gone from guest to regular to having his own TV show called Good News. Mock the Week helped Jack Whitehall transition from club comedian to mainstream star. Even older comics like Michael McIntyre, who didn't rely on Mock the Week in any way, still saw a boost after appearing on the show. These were the years where Mock the Week clips first started going viral on YouTube. Compilations of scenes we'd like to see racked up tens of millions of views and only brought more viewers to the show. But there were still mixed opinions on the show since Frankie's departure, with The Guardian calling it a corporate conference. Without its scary Scottish uncle to keep on its toes, the series lost its edge. When they began series 12 in 2012, Mock the Week saw a noticeable drop in viewers. 8 out of 10 cats, 8 out of 10 cats does Countdown, Would I Lie to You, Have I Got News for You, QI. UK TV was drowning in comedy panel shows who were all competing for the same audience. And while ratings were strong, viewers were turning to other shows with newer concepts. Russell Howard left to pursue his growing individual career, and Andy Parsons left after 10 years on the show, meaning a seat was free for a new regular, who Parsons hoped would go to a woman. Female presence on Mock the Week had been an issue since the show first aired. In its first 7 series, episodes almost always had 6 men and 0 or 1 woman. But at the time, panel shows were male dominated across the board, so Mock the Week wasn't an exception. That's just how the whole industry looked. As the internet became more popular, online pressure groups started to form, noticing the pattern, and more female comics began speaking out. Joe Brand, a comedian who was on the show, said, "Some panel shows are more women friendly than others. The news quiz is a joy. QI also allows you to take your time and join in, but I don't do Mock the Week anymore, and neither do some male stand-ups I know who have tried it once. We just didn't like the prospect of having to bite someone's foot off before they let us say something. Regular panelists on shows can be terrifying. They own that space, and many guest comics suspect they are favoured in the edit, while their own hilarious jokes end up being ejected into the ether." Findings in 2012 found that over 90% of appearances on Mock the Week were male. And at first, the BBC were kind of like, yeah, we just book the funniest comedians, like it is what it is. But in 2014, they changed their attitude completely. The BBC announced that they were no longer going to have panel shows with 0 women on them. Mock the Week was mentioned in virtually every article, and this was the first official BBC rule about the issue, so it was kind of them admitting the problem publicly. No more all-male episodes. And after that BBC mandate, the female bookings increased. Ellie Taylor, Angela Barnes, Sarah Pascoe. Episodes now included at least 1 woman, but something was still off. The new rule felt to the viewers that the BBC was forcing diversity. Like Joe Brand, other female comedians stated they often felt boxed in as guest seat roles and overshadowed by regular male panelists. No woman had a permanent seat, and women comedians rarely appeared on consecutive episodes. Catherine Ryan, who appeared on the show 7 times, explained why she refused to do the show anymore.
"I loved Mock the Week, I loved Dara O'Brien, I loved everyone who worked on that show. But there came a point in my career where I had to stop appearing on that show because I knew that there was just 1 seat for a woman at that time. And they always put us in the same seat, which was weird. They wouldn't even move us around. 1 seat. We knew where that seat was, 1 woman on every episode, and I knew that if I was sitting in that chair, that I was preventing one of my female peers from having a go, and being on that show was life-changing. You would receive so much more exposure, and then people would come to see you on tour. It would really draw people in. It was a game changer of a show. I never boycotted it. I just was realistic about the fact that if I want a different woman to be in this chair, it can be me.
It wasn't only women speaking about the show after they left. Frankie Boyle, as well as other comedians, spoke about censorship on the show, with comedians explaining how some of their best jokes got left out. And Andy Parsons spoke about how the show had changed after he left too. It was a political panel show, and it arguably got the best comics at the time on the show. And then gradually, over the course of a number of years, the BBC decided that actually the political comedy show was going to be Have I Got News For You? And Mock the Week would be a showcase for younger comics who didn't necessarily have much grasp of politics or the news. They weren't interested in them, and therefore, inevitably, the show changed. Rhys James, who was first featured in 2017, explained his different experience on the show, proving that it did definitely change for the comedians too.
Do comedians feel really competitive when they're on a show like that?
I don't think so. Mock the Week had this reputation before I did it, long before I did it, of being this bear pit, and everyone would write articles or in interviews would say, oh God, it's horrible, you can't get a word in and all that sort of stuff. By the time I did it, everyone on it was just sort of like my mate. I remember just like kind of prepping for it the day before, being a bit like rabbit in the headlights about it, being like, fucking hell. But also feeling like my style of comedy suits this show, so I should be okay. I've just got to try and do what I can do on here.
This next era of the show featured fewer dark one-liners, but a cast of new comedians: Ed Gamble, Ed Byrne, Gary Delaney, James Acaster, a sort of safer style of comedy. And while viewership dropped a little, the show had a broader appeal for the online era. Changing lineups meant some casts were brilliant, while others lacked flow. Mock the Week was carried by Frankie Boyle, in my opinion. Without him, it's just shite. Even with him though, it always just seemed a bit formulaic and a little bit cringy. I would have thought lots of comedians don't want to do Mock the Week because they don't like doing something that's so scripted and rehearsed, while insisting on pretending that it's spontaneous and witty. Lots of the people who do appear on it just do bits of their stand-up routine while expecting the audience to pretend that it's something that just popped into their head. Another talking point with Mock the Week was the pre-written jokes and the recycled material, but the comedians obviously had to know what the prompts were before the show, otherwise it wouldn't have been such a success. Plus the comedians still have to write the jokes and remember them, and many fans disagreed that Mock the Week got worse. I've seen people saying that Mock the Week went downhill as soon as Frankie Boyle left, but I thought the opposite, since I thought the show was still worth watching. Even without Frankie Boyle, and comedians like Ed Byrne and Hugh Dennis still brought some dark and funny jokes. I do get why people love Frankie Boyle, and even I find him extremely funny, but the show continued well, even without him. After years of controversies, the BBC had become more cautious with comedy overall. Producers were regularly cutting jokes referencing race, religion, or immigration. Jokes that could spark online rows would now be edited out completely. By late 2020, it became more obvious. Mock the Week was still going, but far from thriving. When COVID struck, Mock the Week adapted, but the tone shifted once again. Socially distant seating, smaller audiences, and harder to build panel chemistry. Viewership was dropping as streaming grew in popularity, and the BBC was considering whether the show still had a place in the new TV landscape. In its 15 years on air, the show's format barely changed, and so some episodes began to feel repetitive and heavily relied on the news of that week. Even in its final years, Mock the Week had flare-ups, accusations of left-wing bias, complaints about jokes going too far, complaints about it becoming too safe. Many comedians were shifting to more monetizable paths like podcasting and online platforms, and eventually the BBC could no longer justify the cost to produce the show. On the 21st of October 2022, Mock the Week aired its final episode. Dara O'Brien and Hugh Dennis sat in the same places they were 17 years earlier. Speaking with The Guardian, Dara O'Brien said, "People were angry at the show for being offensive and male and vicious, and then later, other people were angry because it wasn't offensive and male and vicious, and through all that, it was always just 7 comedians a week trying to get laughs from the studio audience. So none of this criticism matters, none of it, because the people who actually watched the show, who were fans of it, enjoyed the same bits of it we did, the silly parts that had nothing to do with politics or imagined agendas, and were just the great jokes that emerge when you let funny people interact, whatever the red herring of a format you're using." It's true that in the early days the show was too white and too male, and in one early episode there were 5 Cambridge Footlights graduates, with only myself and Frankie Boyle as Celtic exceptions. That changed dramatically over time, but I would say Mock didn't lead the diversification of the comedy world as much as reflect it, and the presence on it of so many female and ethnic minority comedians is because they kicked the door in, and full credit to them. Last week I was performing at the Montreal Comedy Festival and almost the entire British and Irish contingent were Mock alumni. I was quoted this week as saying that Mock had to end because the news had become so ridiculous and we had nothing left to say. This was a joke for the press release. It has, in fact, come to an end because the BBC has less money than it used to, and to do something new, something old has to stop. Featuring over 200 comedians, the show shaped the British comedic voice for almost 20 years, and now with the new landscape, the breakthrough of comedians all from a single show like this may never happen again. To this day, it's still one of the most rewatched panel shows the UK has produced. The show didn't die because it was outdated. The industry just changed around it. So when I say there's never going to be another show like it, there literally isn't.